Michael!
There he is.
How
There he
are you?
is.
There he is. How are you, Michael?
Nice.
I hope you're doing well. The
I am.
discussion with Aspasia was fire. That was really, really good. The topic of anger, and
Thank you.
I really appreciate what you shared. And the topic of anger, I am more and more convinced that anger is some sort of revelation of the human. Like there's something in anger that's actually, well, I was talking with my friend Owen. And I love Owen. He wrote this tremendous book called Defenseology. He's a heck of a
Mm.
scholar. Owen Layson, he goes by Owen and Agnon. He reads books no one else reads. He does a lot on like Clausewitz, Paul Virilio, some of the military historians. He's a great guy. One of the things that Sloterdijk talks about is how there's a psychoanalysis of desire and sexuality, but not of anger. And I think
Hmm.
basically a psychoanalysis of anger is what is in order because I really think it is the revelation of drive, which is what you see in anger is the ability of the human to be motivated on their own at a very high quality, out of the blue, without an object. They just can do it because something breaks. And that ability of the human, like what's really amazing is that no matter how tired or like little food you've had, if somebody pisses you off, you can be like amazingly energized just out of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
And if that is the case, there might be something to anger that deals with the meaning crisis, because I really do think the meaning crisis is so much a
Uh-huh.
motivation crisis. And
Yeah.
like
Yep.
the meaning crisis, when we talk about, I really do think a lot of people, it's not so much they don't have a metaphysical view of the universe. Most people still believe in God, honestly. A lot of the lack of that is for college educated people, middle class, who have maybe deconstructed their traditional understanding of religion. But the majority still basically fall into traditional structures. However, um uh dazed and confused they might be about it here and there and existential, and yet there's still mental health crisis galore, right? There's
Hmm.
still a
Hmm.
certain sort of inability to be motivated, right? And so it's really, I think,
Yeah.
something tremendously connected to human motivation, right? And
Yeah.
I really like what Aspasia was saying as well. And then we'll talk about story, because I know we talk about story, is that or
Yes.
whatever, is that
And maybe
anger.
the intersection of both.
Yeah, who knows? I know like anger has this push up,
Yeah.
anxiety has this push down. And it's very interesting because if the meaning crisis corresponds with a lot of existential anxiety, that pushes down this very thing that when it's not being pushed down, you're incredibly energized, right? And so, like, not coming to terms with anger is also not coming to terms with this force that can be energizing, which makes
Hmm.
sense
Hmm.
in a existential society that's pushing down and repressing. Because I'm also interested, I don't know if you have any thought, I'm just throwing out words. I like to just throw out words and see where they go. So like the other thing that's interesting is you do see so many people who move from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation, desire to drive in a psychoanalytical sense.
Hmm.
A lot of times they're like, I'll show you. Oh yeah? There's a kind of vengeful revenge, but it's actually not, but it's more like you're like, I'll show them. Not necessarily in a bad way, maybe in a good way. Like people like, you'll never write a novel, you'll never do a story. Oh, really? Okay, we'll go, right? And you internalize it in a healthy way. But it's very interesting because in that kind of, no, I can do it. The obstacle is the way. Even that stoicism, like the
Yep.
obstacle is the ways. There's something like, I'll show that obstacle. F that obstacle. I'll make it happen. There's actually, that's actually really good though. Like that kind of like, yeah,
Yeah.
let's
Yeah.
go. That kind of
Yeah.
athletic thing. Like I did wrestling and like long distance running for a long time. And it's like that, like, let's go. That's actually like healthy. Like athletic anger or that sort of like obstacle is the way. That's actually like drive. That's like the
Hmm.
secret to accomplishing great things. And so it's really interesting because I am more and more taken by the Sloterdijk. And I just think about anger all the time because we do talk a lot about desire. We do talk a lot about sex. We do talk a lot about libido. We talk about wanting. But I wonder if that's keeping the conversation in the realm of desire when it really to
Hmm.
talk drive, which is the sublimation of desire, right? Like when if you have if you have a meaning crisis, that's kind of a desire crisis, and that
Yep.
and the only way to address that is ultimately to move back to drive, is to move to drive somehow, which is very
Yeah.
very difficult. I think religions basically created drive when they're at their best, right? Like you're like more like serving
Yes.
God, there's an intrinsic sort of
Yep.
motivation in that. And so there might be something about thinking the psychoanalysis of anger, analyzing anger that's really at the heart of this issue. Again, Lacan, Freud, these people have spilled I'd be curious what they've spilled a lot of ink on the question of the psychoanalysis of desire, but I wonder if there's a psychoanalysis of anger that is
Hmm.
more fundamental. I mean, obviously, desire. You said it yourself. Like anger and care go together, right? So I'm not saying they're
Yeah.
split. Obviously, desire and one and anger go together, but I wonder which is the chicken and which is the egg per se.
Hmm.
Like what
Hmm.
kind of comes first? And I do wonder if the energy of anger comes into desire that creates the apparatus of care, but actually that energy is almost more fundamental than the object of desire itself. That energy looking for a host, that energy looking for
Yeah.
something to attach to.
Yep.
I'd be curious what anything comes up.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I really like everything you just said. I'm thinking of John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastropietro's book that they wrote, Zombies in the 21st Century,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
how, a big thesis of that book is essentially what has happened in modern culture is there's a proliferation of kind of emotionless beings that
Mm,
are walking around. And, you know, whereas I think in previous centuries, although maybe that's changing now with the rise of, like alt-right movements around the world, where there is a lot of anger in men particularly, which I think is important to note. But like this proliferation of kind of this like emotional neutering, kind of
mm,
this stunting of like acknowledging our own somatic and like psychological realities. And yeah, and to point to desire, like I think it's a real shutting off of personal desire in the face of the desires of the machine. Like there was at some point there was this contract that I think a lot of people just implicitly wrote themselves of I have to forfeit my own desires to serve the desires of the state or
yeah.
of the corporation or of the fill in the blank. Um, and so there's that, but then also what I hear and what you're saying is there's a distinction between just pure desire and the expression of an emotion like anger. And that like there's I think a lot of what fuels anger is this external imposition of our own limitations by
Mm,
other people. You
mm,
can't do that. Like only, boys can't do that. Girls can't do that. Like you can't climb that mountain. Like that's only for those other
yeah,
people. And it's like oh, really? Like
yeah,
I'm
right.
gonna I'm gonna test that.
Let's
Like
go.
I'm gonna test that theory. Like, um, and and that can be really healthy because it can be transformational. It can be like I think transformations inherently have to do with limits. I don't know. I feel like
Yeah,
that's some philosopher said something like that. I don't know. I feel like something like that
probably,
is thrown around in
probably,
the
yeah.
net a lot. Yeah. Um, and so yeah, so there is this thing about anger of this. It's a response to, and it seems to really become about when someone else tells that to you. Um, and so that's interesting. And so then what I get really interested about is how do we channel that in a healthy way?
Yeah.
Because like I talked about in the conversation with Aspasia, like the example of Hitler of being in prison and writing Mein Kampf, like it is an outgrowth of anger, um, and this feeling of being wronged, of like having this injustice waged upon them by the Allies and and all the rest. And so how does it happen that the way he chose to channel that was to identify a false scapegoat and create an entire system of government and militarism around that to essentially deal with his own anger. And it's a classic example is you pick an enemy, you externalize your own feelings, you pick an enemy that you feel like you can beat, so that in so doing that, your own anger is alleviated. But then the irony is it's never going to be alleviated as long as there are Jewish people walking on the face of the earth, and non-Aryan people walking on the face of the earth. You're never going to be satisfied. So how do we prevent that from happening and create the conditions where anger is used in service of, and my own personal feeling is it has to point back to the self. And like I saw this commercial recently for I think it was like Adidas or something, and they were talking about how like the greatest competitors don't compete against other people, they compete against their own limits. And I thought it was like really brilliant, and I was like motivated to get off the couch and go for a run. I was like, yeah, my own limits. Let's put it to the test.
Yeah.
And you know, that also has pitfalls with it can become narcissistic and you can lose sight of the other, but how to channel anger, because I think something that Aspasia and I agreed on and what we were talking about is like it's not enough to just allow someone to have the expression of the emotion. It's like what happens after that, and um and how is that directed and how is that challenged, channeled, I should say. So yeah, those are just some thoughts.
No, magnificent. And I can't find a pen, so I have like a coloring pencil right here. And I found muffins
It
in
looks
my bag.
extremely dull.
Yeah, it is actually. It's the only one I can find, but it's that awkward thing where I'm like, where is it? I don't need a Lego. And I found a muffin in my bag. I don't know why there was a muffin in my
Oh,
bag, but that's
score.
probably delicious. But no, you said a lot there that's fantastic. What I'm really interested in is like you mentioned the scapegoat, so anger and all these different things. So there's one thing about anger that there's an intensity. There's something about human beings that are scared of intensity in general, not just anger. Like if you meet someone who's really dedicated to a hobby or like they're like really into stamp collecting, you're like, oh, that's kind of odd. Like anyone who has a certain like intensity. There's something about human beings that don't like intensity very much, especially before it has been socially validated. Like, if you were to meet Kobe Bryant after he's Kobe Bryant, you're like, oh, that's amazing. But before Kobe Bryant is Kobe Bryant and he's doing like days and days of free throws, you'd be like, that's a little much, right? There's something about intensity that makes us uncomfortable, right? And that applies obviously in anger because it's an intensity that seems always nested socially. So it has a bearing on you. At least Kobe Bryant doing free throws doesn't like have social ramifications necessarily. It's kind of more isolated. But even then, there's still a kind of like ness, a kind of like weirdness, unless they are socially validated. Like if there's intensity that wins the championship or intensity that makes a lot of money, then we're okay. But one of the issues is we talk all the time about wanting our kids to be really successful, but then if they actually do the stuff of being really successful, we're worried about them. Because they're going off to India and learning calligraphy like Steve Jobs, and we're like, no, that's not good. But wait, that's what those people did. Wait, why are you like, sleeping on a cot or like living in poverty? Because that's what a lot of the great saints did. It's like, no, I want you to be like that, but I don't want you to do the things necessary to become that. Okay. That's okay. Or on the flip side, there's a narcissistic forcing one into it when it's not in the realm of drive, but in like, a pleasing or a neurotic power structure. So, et cetera, so forth, right? But the point is there's something about intensity that is problematic. And it's problematic also because it is dangerous, right? The person who becomes Kobe Bryant could just as easily become a hoarder who is really like unable and really attached, and there's a certain intensity that leads to them hoarding, or maybe being like Kurt Gödel, never eating because they think their food is always poison, right? But the eclectic, the different, the standing out that makes us nervous. Add intensity to that makes us unhappy, because all of it, and it's interesting because all of that is tied to some sort of breaking or disturbing of a social field, right?
Mm-hmm.
So So intensity seems to disturb us because it's also different. It stands out because it's not the defining feature of our daily life, right? Just like the eclectic individual, just like the stamp collector, the extreme stamp collector, just like Kobe Bryant, just like the person that's suddenly angry. So there's something about intensity here that's very interesting. And I really do think like there's something about even like meeting like greatness that actually could inspire, but also a lot of times greatness makes people uncomfortable. Like if you know this
Yeah.
individual has done great, that makes you uncomfortable, right? But there's another form of intensity that can inspire, but typically the intensity that inspires it moves into the realm of social acknowledgement. It has been, but that makes sense because if the main thing that makes us uncomfortable is the disturbance of the social field, then an intensity that has been confirmed by the social field switched from being disturbing or throwing us off to something that then inspires us. But the problem is the social field is then at that point hiding us from this kind of mystery of intensity itself that seems to kind of throw us off, right?
Yeah.
And so also what you see is there's some sort of revelation in the experience of anger that human beings have within them a capacity for a certain intensity that can kind of come out, right? Well, if that intensity was sublated or sublimated, well, who knows what humans could achieve, right? Nietzschean childhood, self-turning wheel, what sainthood? Lewis talks about never meeting a mere mortal, right? What could be possible, right? One of the reasons why I'm extremely interested, and Deleuze talks about intensities and different things, which is interesting. One of the reasons I am interested about that intensity is because the psychoanalysis of anger is a psychoanalysis of intensity.
Hmm.
And I think when we end up talking, what's interesting then about anger and scapegoating is the reason why I keep talking about psychoanalysis is because the form of anger does seem very isomorphic to desire. And what I mean by that is the following. So as we know in Lacan, there's this notion of the lost object. You desire a thing you cannot get, and precisely because it is denied to you, the desire stays alive, right? And if you actually got
Hmm.
the object, the desire would end, right? And that kind of almost gets into Blondel. So then, bringing in the Zizekian and the Giazons and the death drive, what you have to do is come to enjoy your very inability to get the object, of which then you
Yeah.
engage in certain self-deceptions to make yourself believe that you're not intentionally coming to enjoy the denial of the object so that you can actually continue to have desire because you don't know how to sublimate desire into drive, right? So there's a
Mm.
certain denial of the object to maintain what? Motivation. What's very
Hmm.
interesting is anger with the scapegoat is very similar to that. Because basically what you're doing is if we got rid of all the Jews like Hitler, then we would be happy. It's literally impossible to get rid of all the Jews. It is by definition a goal you cannot obtain, right? But the anger then stays alive
Yeah.
because it is always being denied the goal, right? So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
goal is
Yeah.
always denied, so the anger stays alive, which then maintains an intensity that can be politically captured or feel meaningful or be one where people feel belong. Yeah, we got a crowd. Yeah, man. The crowd, the energy of the crowd, right? The zeitgeist. So there's an
Yeah.
intensity that then feels like we're going to come back. Also, regain German glory, read the lost object of the nation, so on and so on. So there's something very psychoanalytical about the way that anger is maintained in the same. Well, let's put it this way: what you see, I guess you almost could say that what the death drive is to desire, as I'm putting it with Lacan and Zizek and Giazons. The Giazons word I can never say. You don't say it that way. I'm just a country boy. I don't know words. What the death drive is to desire, it's almost like a scapegoat drive to anger. It's a way of actually coming to enjoy the denial of the success of anger by always having a scapegoat that you can never kill for good. Like the funny thing about the scapegoat in the Nazi example is you actually want a scapegoat that you can never kill. Like a scapegoat that you could finally kill actually destroys the whole point, right? Because then you'd have to admit that it wasn't the Jews, right? So what's very interesting is in the anti-Semitism that you see in Nazism, there's a structuring of the scapegoat that is always going to deny you the object that is the goal that is motivating your anger in the
Yeah.
same way that the desire seeks an object that it cannot get and then comes to enjoy that denial, right?
Hmm.
Um, but it
And it keeps you
almost,
in service. It keeps you in service to
yeah,
the cause.
yeah,
You don't have to worry about your human capital betraying you. As
exactly.
long as there's Jewish people,
You're good to
you
go.
have you have a fight. Yeah.
Exactly. And you see what one of the reasons, and then I'll give it back to it. One of the reasons that I think the topic of anger really needs to be thought is because I believe that a lot of what we're seeing in the world today, like popularism to all the things like the anger that's happening, when the jig is up on the functioning of the desire to motivate us, because the structure of desire denying itself its object to create a infinite motivation of which then capitalism benefits from, because this is very important. Like if everyone is motivated by a lost object and comes to enjoy never getting that object, you have perfect productivity for the system because everyone's working forever, right? They're buying objects, they're consuming things, and coming to enjoy the fact that they never get the thing. Well, that's like a perfect battery for the economic system, right? Like, because everyone then is all, it's infinite desire, right? Here's the problem. There's eventually a point where people actually come to be unable to deny anymore that they're engaging in desire as this function. The plausible deniability runs out, right? So they start to see, yeah, I'm fooling myself. That I because the desire as lost object only works until you realize you're doing this, right? You have to engage in all these mental gymnastics to convince yourself you're not doing it, right? Well, the longer the system uses that, eventually people go, that's what we're doing. And now we have a meaning crisis because we can't motivate ourselves because we know we're intentionally denying ourselves the lost object to keep motivating ourselves. Therefore, it can't motivate us anymore because we know that's the mechanism, right? Well, then guess what? You either go into nihilism or what do you go into? You move to anger because you can replicate isomorphically the same structure of motivation, but basing it on a scapegoat or basing it on a recovery of something that's lost, right? And then what's
Mm.
so horrifying about that is that one feels more plausible to you because the Jews are still around. We don't have America like it used to be, right? Like it really, and then there seems to be evidence of a world where, it used to be that way. And so, yeah, then we can do it in the same way that you saw pictures of celebrity and it looks like, it will be that way. Well, you just do a similar thing through a popularism, right? And so anger is falling into this. To me, and I'll give it back to you. To me, the problem is we're attaching anger to object versus horizon so it can turn into drive. Like that I would need to elaborate on that, but we're bringing over training of attachment to desire to objects, bringing over that structure, attaching anger to objects or goals. And as a result, anger is turning into a very intense form of the psychoanalytical drive of desire, as opposed to being sublimated into drive. I'd have to expand on that, but let me throw it to
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that, but yeah, the Lacanian lost object idea is a really I think it really frames and structures what we're talking about really well because um it elucidates the idea of the kind of infinite, inexhaustible fount of desire once you structure your um your kind of ultimate reality as something that fundamentally can never be achieved. Um, and it's like paradise, it's like heaven, it's like this utopia, utopic vision that by its very definition can't be achieved on earth, but the pursuit of it is what gives people meaning. And so I would like to throw at that the example of Hitler and the Jews and the scapegoat anger is a misattributed um, version of what religions do,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
which is to say, and I think this
Yeah.
is why Christianity, like as I'm kind of reading the Bible more and like doing, Bible study, like I've been really intrigued by like what is it about Christianity, the story of Christianity, the mechanisms of Christianity that allowed it to be the world's biggest religion? Like, what is it about it? And I think it's this this the sense that um, the Messiah lived on earth and was a real person and yet is also God.
Yeah.
And so it really structures this mechanism by which people feel like they have the agency and the ability as a human person to come in contact with God just as Jesus did. But God is also beyond this earthly realm. And so, you hear Christians talk about it all the time, like the worship and the service of God is a never-ending quest. Like it is never something that you can obtain or have in its entirety. You will never be done with it. You will always have to, um, you know, ask for repentance. Like you will always continue to be in service of God, and so thus there's your meaning, there's your purpose, there's your lifelong quest, right? And I mean, it's you can see how that has been corrupted, where you know powerful religious leaders subjugate people into false ideas about what worship means, that they can get them to do what they want, serve them, you know, go on crusades, like things like that. But in its purest form, religion is a lost object, right?
Mm.
Like the life of prayer is like a constant, like, reveal yourself to me, God, so that I can know 1% more of you today, kind of thing. Um, and so, huh, when people talk about like wokeism, it's like a new religion. Like I kind of understood what they meant, and I think now it's starting to become clearer, like what that actually means, because there's there's a sense in which what's happening there is like, and then what's happening in response to it is kind of two sides of the same coin, of like these sides that are placing scapegoats that can never fully be eliminated, but it like fuels this movement and this belief that people have of like, oh, if we can just, you know, assassinate all the healthcare CEOs in the
Yeah.
world,
Yeah.
like, and topple all the systems, then, and then on the other side, you have this like kind of allergy to that of like, okay, these systems are like almost too big to fail. Like, how do you even, like, how can that even be like a sensible, feasible thing? And it's like, maybe that's not even the point, because to believe in that as a possibility is enough to fuel movements and to like to engage the public. And so I want to hear more about what you left off on, but I also want to hear your thoughts on A, if you agree with that, or disagree, and then B, how we, or can we, incentivize social structures to um, have lost objects, but them not be um, misattributed and become vengeful and hateful, and instead, be oriented towards, the true, the good, and the
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah. No, outstanding. I think absolutely that structure of anger and what we were saying with the lost object is what we see in political movements, wokeism, fascism, et cetera, so forth. There's a wonderful thinker, Eric Hoffman, Hoffer. He wrote a very important book called True Believer. And the idea that what you see in the structure of mass movements and totalitarianism is certainly religious-like. And it's basically the same epistemological moves like you see in conspiracies, in really complicated like understandings of reality, because all of these are creating structures that you can operate in that are either so complex that you can never finish them, like a complicated Gödel Platonic system, or a conspiracy that has so many moving parts that it's hard to keep up with, or maybe some sort of complicated metaphysical system by which you understand reality. All of these are something you can situate yourself in, create a certain motivation according to, and yet you never actually reach the end up. So it creates a certain simulation of the religion, but it is all in the realm of the finite, right? It is all kind of materialized, right? And that happens with the political. Once we get rid of these people, once we get back to this, once we do that, everything will be okay. And it sounds very, very, very close to kind of the religious idea, right? So what's the difference? Well, one of the key ideas of, say, Christianity, and if we take the idea of the incarnation seriously, or things like the sacrament, it's not that the thing you need is away from you. It's in front of you and you can't see it. And that's a very critical
Yeah.
difference.
Yep.
Because, the issue is that the reason why you don't have heaven on earth is because you, right now, have not risen to the occasion to have the eyes to see it or to behold it. You haven't garnered the attention, the Simone Weil awareness, the whole, dare I say, holiness, the sense of the beautiful. So it's not so much that you need to go somewhere, it's that you need depth, right? So what ends up happening is many of these religious, these secular religions, or seemingly repetitions of the lost object phenomenon or structure, is a distance thing. Once we go from A to B to C, then we got it, right? Christianity comes along and says, no, Jesus already did it all. You don't need to go anywhere. You just need to acknowledge it. And you need to be able to see everything that's already in front of you in light of this thing that already occurred. Christianity has a very bizarre temporal notion of already not yet, as N.T. Wright puts it, right? Like new creation is now and yet not. That's really important, because you can't really say communism already not yet. It's not yet. Can you say like reforming healthcare? Is it already or not? No, it's just not yet. The key is that all of these other structures, and this is why they're not able to function as horizons, and that's the key I'm going to turn to on this next part, is that they're not yet, not already not yet. And it's also really important. So Christianity has this strange temporal claim where new creation is now and yet not now at the same time. And you're the difference, your ability to see and cultivate yourself. And it also has this idea that God became man. This is a really big idea, because if God becomes man, then the natural created order has some sort of capacity to connect with God. Like God eats bread. God walks around. So the created order can like be a path on which God can walk, and God can eat food, and God can feel things. Okay, so we cannot assume then that nature and God are totally split. That there is actually some sort of, at the very least, potential connection. Well, that actually changes everything. Because if there's at the very least a potential connection, if the word good at least means possibly 0.0001% of what it means to say God is good, there's just some small percentage, well, then it is not necessarily a waste of time to study nature, or to learn how to take walks, or to eat food. Suddenly, there can be a potential sacredness to nature, right? It could be there. And this is where you get these long debates between, analogy of being, total depravity, God, apophatic, all these kind of debates, right? Without getting into that theology, without getting into that debate, the very fact that debate even happens is a game changer. Like if you're even debating the relation between the creative order and God, that was a big thing for Christianity, because for most of history, nature and God have nothing to do with one another. In fact, God is completely pure from it, right? So there wouldn't even be a debate if there's such thing as an analogy of being. And yet that debate existed in Christianity, and people took different sides. Well, the very fact they took different sides meant there was at least some sort of notion that God came into the creative order, that he's incarnational, and he has some sort of double hypostatic union or whatever, right? Well, that changes everything, because that also is necessary for it to make sense that in the thing in front of you is new creation. Like, why would you need to learn to have attention, or to see what is in front of you, or to talk in language of already not yet, unless God somehow has impacted the created order that you're living in right now, right? So the metaphysics of Christianity make it plausible that talking about already not yet, learning how to see what is in front of you, is actually a valid way to live your life, right? Because for most of history, the goal is to either get to heaven, to basically get somewhere, right? Like to go somewhere. Whereas Christianity makes it plausible to dwell and actually find new creation in the dwelling and in the face-to-face relation of the other and in the community. So it creates a certain immediacy to transcendence. The immanent and the transcendent come together, right? This is really important, because I would argue that even if you don't believe in Christianity, that structure, dare I say, metaphysical structure is the only way to deal with the problem of desire. There's no other way to do it.
Yeah.
And it is the only way to
Yep.
sublimate drive. So ways to think about it. Most of the time what we desire is an object, something we can get. Maybe we desire a wall to shield ourselves from pain. And unfortunately, very often, I was talking with Owen about this, our main experiences in modernity are of objects and walls, right? Of things we can control and get, pick up and manipulate, or something blocking my line of sight, right? And dividing me from the outside. Without getting too much into it, I would say this makes us very drunk on logos and eros. Objects are erotic. Logos is division, definition, clear, like splitting. This is a house, this is nature, clean lines, right? The third part of the classical human soul is Thymos. It is human recognition. Thymos, as I was saying with Aspasia, Thymos, which is, of course, linked with aggression, anger, courage, battlefield, all of these things that we're saying are repressed, right? For me, the metaphoric structure of Thymos is a horizon. When you go outside and your line of sight is not blocked by a wall, you see a what? A horizon. A horizon is already not yet. You can, in fact, see it. It is, in fact, there. And yet it is beyond your sight as well. But it does not deny your sight. Your sight sees that of which the sight can't go over, right? That is Thymos. Thymos is a recognition of something, because a horizon also says back to you, try me. It doesn't say you can't. It says, let's see, right? Whereas most of the time objects are denied for you, it's like, it's because it doesn't fulfill you, or a neurotic structure comes in and says you can't have it, right? There's only two ways you don't get an object. One, you don't care for it anymore, or two, power says you can't have it, right? So it also makes sense that in modernity, when we're perpetually experiencing walls and objects, that our sense of authority is always a bad authority, because it's always arbitrary. And let me explain what I mean by that. And I was speaking with Owen about this. When you go into a city, there's really nowhere you can't physically go. You could walk into any room. If you can't go somewhere, it's because you don't have the money, you don't have the connections, or an authority is stopping you, right? So the entire experience of a city is neurotic hierarchy in a Lacanian sense. It's power, it's authority. You can't, no, right? So you're constantly experiencing inaccessibility, not in terms of your literal thermotic capacity, but in your lack of, say, the logos to figure out how to get the money, and the lack of authority, right? And that's why you're denied.
Yeah.
Nature?
Yeah.
If you go out in the forest, you can go anywhere if you're up to it. If you can climb that mountain, very different experience of denial. A mountain doesn't say you need $50 to climb me. It says you need to exercise, right?
Yeah.
So the experience
Interesting.
of nature is hierarchy is based on capacity, which is concrete. It is not arbitrary. In the city, hierarchy is based on something that feels like a social convention, that feels arbitrary and thus not fair. I could go into this building. I have legs. It's not hard to go into this building. I just can't because I don't have $50, right? I don't meet the convention. So it is not by chance that we have such a confused notion of hierarchy in modernity, when the majority of our experiences of hierarchy are not the objective, object-based hierarchy of a mountain, but instead social conventions, which are logos and eros-based, right? And so what ends up happening is, therefore, anger, which I would argue is best directed toward a horizon. Oh yeah, you said try me? Watch me. Bam, and you go to the mountain. Anger, when it is primarily phenomenologically situated in cities, how can anger reply to the you don't have $50? Stealing, punching, repressing. Anger cannot help you get the $50 in that moment, right? And probably not at work too, because if you go to work and you're angry, like you're going to get fired or something, right? But in nature, it can be a great thing. You're pissed off at the horizon, you're pissed off at the mountain, you go right to the top, baby. Like you just climb up, it doesn't matter how bad it gets, right? So in nature,
you kill your dinner.
Yeah, you kill your dinner.
Survive.
That's right. So in nature, which is the horizon, anger is an incredible asset. In fact, it might be the only reason you survive, right? Because that intensity of motivation comes out of nowhere and you just make it happen, right? And also, too, what's very interesting, I was thinking more and more about this double move between anxiety pushing down and anger pushing up, that actually seems healthy in nature. Because if you're climbing up and you get like, wait, if I take this, I won't be able to, let me go back and then go up. Well, you stop your motivation based on the terrain and then you go back, but then you see, it's like, no, I can't get to the top. Like there's a way in which, oh, that's a snake, repress, anxiety, stop. Don't let your anger just say, screw you, snake. Well, now you're dead. But then you keep going. So it's interesting. I do wonder if that movement, push down, up, is actually quite healthy, perhaps in a natural terrain with surprises and unexpected things. But when you go into a city, that does nothing for you. Because, like, you know, you're anxious. Well, that doesn't help you deal with the fact you don't have $50. You're angry. That doesn't help you with the fact you don't have $50. You got to go logos figure out how to get $50. Oh, you don't have the college degree? Sorry. So then you should. So then that's what happens. You have popularist uprising. Because where else can, let me put it, where else can the anger go in a city, quote unquote, but into the popularist uprising or the violence? Because a city is a place of logos and eros. You figure out how to get money, you figure out how to get connections, and then you can have the pleasure. You can have the object. And then when you find out the object doesn't fulfill you, you go work more to get more money. So capitalism just works, right? So it's a kind of, the way I was speaking with Owen, and then I'll give it to you.
Mm-hmm.
Capital today, not to say capitalism is always bad, it just depends on what you mean. Capital today is a conspiracy of logos and eros against Thymos. It is a conspiracy against Thymos. And you see, then here's the issue. In Plato, the only way that you can like control the appetites is through Thymos. The appetites of eros destroy the human soul without Thymos. And we see that. Like a lot of people who climb mountains or who did athletics or who do tough things don't tend to be drunk on consumerism. They don't tend to be people who are materialistic. It's very interesting. You don't see many more thymotic people end up in materialism unless they become a famous athlete and want to show it off. But that's where the social recognition then goes back into the eros structure and you get all sorts of issues. But a lot of people in philosophy, a lot of people in the arts have a very interesting athletic background. And it's very interesting. Not always. I don't want to universalize that. But actually, a lot. I worked with, there's so many artists we work with. A lot of the artists and philosophers who don't have an athletic background, they can be in it for the wrong reasons. They can be in it for the philosophy position or to talk about how misunderstood they are. It can become egoic. Not always, but there's something about the thematic. This is what Plato, the thematic helps contain the egoic, right? Which then the egoic tends to be consumeristic. It tends to consume its ego. It tends to conflate its ego, right? So it pleases itself because it likes itself. So it consumes and consumes. And so it then is a perfect engine of capital, right? So a conspiracy of logos and eros against Thymos creates a death drive that is a self-turning wheel for capital at the expense of the human, of course. But then, of course, the only way to deal with the human, and then I'll give it to you, is to somehow recover Thymos, which is aggression and which is anger, in a manner that is attached to a horizon versus an object or a wall. But then how do we regain that? Well, Christianity offers a model by learning to see in the wall right in front of you the sacred, by learning to actually see everything. Because even if you're in a city, there's still a potential of seeing a horizon there, because you could see it as participating in new creation, right? Like the Christian metaphysics provides a non-contingent structure by which to always find a horizon, regardless of what situation you're in, right? So I think basically what ends up happening, this is my point. It is not by chance that the decline of Christianity has corresponded with the rising of the conspiracy of logos and eros against Thymos, right? Because if you lose the non-contingent possibility of a horizon wherever you go by a sacramental logic, well, the only way then you can have motivation come back is by going back to desire. Well, desire has to be based on the lost object. Well, then we're back in our problem, right? And it's not by chance then that psychoanalysis as desire-based really takes off with the decline of Christianity, because up to that point, you could have a motivational structure that is more thematic and horizon-based, and then as it declines, what ends up happening is you have to go in the other direction, or you have to unleash Thymos. Well, that's what? That's popularism. That's uprising. And how did basically well, this is what we did. The way, and then I'll give it to you, is the way we dealt with the problem of Thymos is basically trying to convince it to shut itself up with pleasure. But, Plato would say you can never do that. Thymos is not ever anything that goes away because it is, here's a key, an essential dimension of human existence. Anger is part of what you are to be human. So there's no amount of consuming, no amount of pleasure or rationality or that makes it go away, right? So it is always, always there. So the effort of the market, eros, to please anger away is a failure. Plato would have told you that long ago.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Logos, the Enlightenment project, which is the idea that we will rationally see that anger is irrational and therefore not go into anger. Well, Plato would have told you that's stupid because it's actually literally, if you did that, you'd be a robot. And that's why the technology is taking over, because what is technology but a rational agent that doesn't have, well, Thymos. It has eros because it has a telos that is programmed into it. It has an object and a desire, but it doesn't have Thymos. The ultimate manifestation of the conspiracy of logos and eros is the machine, is the neckland. It totally makes sense. And Plato would have said, yeah, right. The only way to have the human is to find a harmony between Thymos, eros, and logos. And then Francis Fukuyama and all of them would come in and say, yeah, but if we do that, we could be nuked. So, we can't really risk the most, because what if we have World War II or whatever, and it gets out of balance with, and we all die, right? So we basically did this. We said, well, people are just going to have to get over Thymos, because otherwise we all die, right? But that means we dealt with Thymos, and I'll give it to you. I've said that like 9 times. We dealt with the problem of Thymos by threat, not mastery. And that doesn't work because because it's an essential dimension of the human being. If it's an essential dimension of the human being, you can't thread it away. You can only master it, like a lute, like harmony, right? So we tried by nuclear annihilation, basically, and going to jail and losing your career, we tried to threat Thymos away. And we do that to that very day. If someone gets angry, we threaten to socially blackmail them. They get angry, we make them feel bad, right? We are still to this very day dealing with the problem of anger through threat. The only way to deal with anger going back is mastery. And if you don't master it, then logos and eros in a conspiracy against you will destroy you, and you will have no care. Anger is tied to care. If you get rid of anger, you get rid of care, because care is a horizontal disposition. Care is like Heidegger told you. It's a horizon of being. You get rid of anger, you get rid of care. This is the thing. Like you were saying it with Aspasia. Like there's something about care in anger. It's like the same thing. It's the same energy. Like human dimensions are not linear. They are geometrical shapes. Like care and anger are on the same shape. They're on the same object. Like if you pull care out, anger does not go over here. Anger follows it. If you pull anger, care goes with it. It's the same object. Like human emotions are not these linear things that you can pull apart. They're more like milk and dye. You can't pull emotions apart. They always go together. So the issue is that if you try to threaten Thymos away, which is repression, you will likewise threaten away care. So then, of course, you get a meaning crisis. Of course you do. Because that's the only way to not get nuked, apparently. The only way to not get nuked is for everyone to not be passionate. If people are passionate, they might kill each other and we all get nuked, right? So, and Francis Fukuyama at the end of his book knew that. He said that. He's more tragic and interesting. And Owen brings it out. But if you try to threaten away the problem of Thymos, you also get rid of care. But then that means to get Heideggerian care and motivation and drive, we have to, face each other and learn how to be human and how to be together. And that's hard because we don't even know how to talk and how to relate in different things. So then we find ourselves in a thing. But I definitely think, I definitely think it doesn't help us to think the problem of Thymos and anger when our phenomenological experience is so rarely of horizons. Because then all we can think about anger is toward walls, of kicking them down or breaking them down, and then we don't have a home, or we're dying in the cold, or we throw objects and they're denied to us. So we don't know, we can't have a healthy relation to anger because anger is supposed to be the energy toward a horizon, but we don't experience that very much anymore. So we end up, I think, very, very confused.
Yeah. Yep. So much there. I love it. So what you said at the end about care and anger and them being connected, I want to pick up on that first. Care seems to be something that requires us to face our death anxiety.
Yeah.
Because to care about something means if it's gone, you're gonna feel it. Like,
Yeah.
and so your degree of care is proportional to how hurt, if that thing were to be taken away,
Yeah.
you would feel.
Yep.
And what we've socialized people to do is fear death and see it as this morose ending that is something to, to be mourned, and something that also is comes with it like a lot of shame. Like, oh, if this relationship ends, like it's either my fault or their fault. And so it either stirs up shame or anger. And that's really the only way that we can internalize or make meaning of endings. And so we've essentially killed off care by creating all this existential anxiety about death and endings. And I don't just mean like capital D death. Like,
Yeah.
I have a piece that I wrote where I talk about, you know, um, the we die every day essentially.
Sure.
There are beliefs, there are perspectives, there are habits that we have to get rid of, and dispense with all the time.
Yeah.
And I think so many people are rigid and unable to do that because I think they fundamentally don't care about themselves enough to change. Like, it's the cliche that you know, people in relationships say all the time is like, like if you care about me, you'll change. If you care about me, you'll
Yeah.
do these things that I'm asking for, right? Um, and I think care, like I used to be so allergic to anger, and you watched my episode
Yeah.
with Aspasia, and there's like all these reasons in my childhood for why that was, like domineering father figure. um and so when I would see people get like passionately angry about things that they care about not working, like not working the way that they
Yeah.
wanted to, a project that they really care about, like getting shut down, or business partner leaving, or a relationship ending, and then kind of being like passionately like frustrated about it. Like, I would always see that as evidence that this person was like not mature, because,
Yeah.
oh, here they are expressing anger.
Sure.
And then I realized at a certain point that there's a real qualitative difference between anger that's fueled by care and anger that's fueled by hatred.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and that has precipitated this journey of like me identifying my own anger that is fueled by care. And I've just seen this like dramatic difference in
Yeah.
how firm I am in my convictions, how like much more courageous I am, much more like bold I am, much more willing to take risks. But also how much more things hurt when they don't go my way, right? Um, and so I think once that's realized, once people kind of get over that hurdle, then there needs to be like an adequate kind of meaning making like apparatus to be able to hold one's disappointment and anger
Yeah.
and grief. And I think that's where a lot of people turn to religion, where it's like, okay, you know, um, this relationship ended, but um, let's bring in gratitude,
Yeah.
and let's bring in forgiveness, and let's bring in appreciation, and
Yeah.
let's bring in how much closer you are to God now than when you started, and all these things. And so yeah, and I really think the whole concept of themos is really interesting. What I was thinking about, how essentially in industrial urban societies, how themos has no place to go. I think that's why we're so bored,
Yes. Yes.
because they're like, and I think especially why men are facing a crisis, because like,
Yes.
where does that energy go?
Yes.
And where's their potential for that energy to go in a place that is not deemed wrong or socially
Yeah.
apprehensible. It's like, I don't know, the boxing gym and the gym, and I mean, I don't know, like where
Right.
where do you go to do it? And I think that's why like sports and athletics, to bring it to another point you were making, is so um crucial for people's development early on. Like, I played golf at an international level when I was 11, 12, 13. And um, there's just this like fuel and dedication and drive to be the best, especially in an individual sport where it really isn't about beating anyone else. It's like, it's
Exactly.
about controlling between the ears,
Yeah.
and, and I think for a lot of people that's really helpful. For unfortunately for a lot of people, that becomes their religion, and then once it's over, they fall into a pit of despair.
Yep.
They gamble away all their money. They you know destroy relationships, et
Yep.
cetera, et cetera. um but I think there is something about athletics that is like, it's I think what it does too, like I remember like I was just reminiscing on this with a friend the other day. Like, I would be on the putting green like late at night, and I would just be hitting these putts, and I'd be like, this is for the Masters, like this is for the
Yeah.
US Open, like.
Yeah.
And there's this like real like grip that it has on your imagination of like, I could be something great one day, because I've seen it. Like, I would go to professional golf tournaments and I would see human beings do things that you just can't even describe. And so it's like, and that thing that you said, already not yet, it's like, it's so apparent if you go and watch
Yes.
professional sports. It's like,
Yes.
this is already being done. And once upon a time, this person was just a kid like me, and they just
Exactly.
put in a lot of hours. They're not some magical special person. They just did this thing a ridiculous amount of times.
Yes.
Um, and so there's a grip that has on someone, and it can really captivate them and like straighten people out, set them on a course for like a life of a work ethic, like a certain type of work ethic and courage and humility as well, to continue to get
Yeah.
better. Um, but even sports is like, it's limited by the constructs of the game.
Yeah.
That it's, we talk about, it's a finite game versus an infinite game.
Yeah.
And so, how do you take that same thematic drive and orient it towards something infinite in a
Yeah.
world that seems to not value that? I think that's why so many people are attracted to the woods, to
Yep.
nature, to go out and build their own house with their own two hands,
Yep.
become self-sufficient, things like that. Um, but then, it seems like today, like there's kind of a trade-off between exercising one's thematic drive and being nested in community.
Yeah.
And there's so many. I'm getting more interested in like things like permaculture and like
Yeah.
things like that. And there's apparently, I came into it thinking everyone in permaculture is like, you know communal and loving and hippies, and they all just want to live in a commune together. And apparently there's a lot of grifters and preppers who are into permaculture, because they don't want anything to do with the world, and
Yeah.
kind of Ted Kaczynski
Yeah.
type
Yeah.
people. um and there's something going on there where it's like people are reacting to a world that they don't see themselves in,
Right.
and
Good.
are removing themselves from it and becoming, really isolationist.
Yep.
And so that's also not great in the
Yep.
long term. That's not going to be good. um so, how to orient community around Themos
Yep.
is another interesting thing, because I think ultimately, it is an intrinsically motivated, it does come from that, but I think it ultimately wants an other,
Yep.
to engage with, to interface with. So yeah. Yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, I mean magnificent. So there's a few, I love what you said on care, and how the thing that you care about can destroy you. Well, the horizon can destroy you. The mountain can destroy you. So I don't think it's by chance that anger and care go together. And I think you said something very important on the difference between, I almost want to say anger hyphen care and anger hyphen hate. They're very different in quality. And I think the anger of hate is tied to walls and objects, arrows and logos. You tend to hate someone who
Hmm.
denies you the thing you want to consume. They put up a wall you don't like. They defined you. We tend to hate people who say like you're like what where does hatred often come from? Often it comes from people being called something, given a name, given a wall, given a definition they don't like, and they hate you. You said they're a bad worker, you humiliated them. Like it's very interesting. Hatred often, I think, I do associate with walls. Because if someone humiliates you, you feel trapped in being seen that way. You feel walled in, right? Like an experience is interesting because once it happens, it can't unhappen, right? And often, to speak very generally, hatred gets linked with experiences of some kind that people can't get away from. Like they want to get away with this. Like maybe, a Christian kills their child, so they hate, Christians forever, right? Because, there's an experience, they feel walled in by it. It has become something that traps them. And the hatred is this kind of idea of I'm trapped in it and I can't destroy it, because that's a key characteristic of an experience. If someone kills your child, you can't escape the room. It is a memory, it's an experience. So it's something you're trapped in that you can't leave, right? But it has this wall-like quality, this inescapable wall-like quality, like 2 + 2 = 4 in The Underground Man, right? It's not a wall and yet it is, right? So there's something very logosy about hatred. And I think anger hatred is an anger directed towards something like that, something like a wall, something like a logo, something like an experience, right? Anger care is tied to a horizon. Like it's like there's a horizon, like a relationship. You care about this job and you lost it. The horizon was lost. So you care about that horizon, but it's much more horizon-like. You care about the relationship, right? It's not merely that the person forgot to put the salt back on the table. They're angry about that. But it's that they feel like the horizon is threatened of the relationship itself because you care about that. And if they didn't do that, that kind of suggests they've lost sight of the horizon, right? So the object is symbolic of the horizon, right? Here's the issue, though. The anger, let's say anger, care, and anger, hatred, they're always kind of dancing, right? Because logos, thymos, and eros are always there. They're all three of them, right? So anger that's horizon based can quickly and slowly and gradually become anger that is hatred based because it gets
Hmm.
attached to the object and loses sight of the horizon, right? What is on a horizon? Objects, but you got to not look at the objects and keep your eye on the horizon, right? You'll see trees and outlines of trees and houses, right? So what can happen in a relationship is anger care that doesn't keep its eye on the horizon can become anger hate, but they're actually different qualities at different time. And I actually think we can
Hmm.
understand it as a movement of orientation from horizon to objects and walls. Because that also happens in a relationship. If your spouse humiliates you or they make you experience something that you didn't want to experience and you can't get out of, that creates a hate feeling, I think.
Yeah.
So it's really important to identify when the anger is anger care, not anger hate, because that means the first thing is still the first thing. Okay, so now it's simply a matter of refocusing on that, re-engaging with that, and remembering. Memory is very important here. Memory and anger go together. That was good. Like remembering the first thing. It's like, yes, the salt shaker should not have been left there. But don't sacrifice the horizon that makes you care about the salt shaker or the horizon blocking the salt that the salt shaker is on. Don't lose sight of that in the salt shaker. Next time he'll do better,
Yeah.
but don't let it become about the object. So it's, for me, a way to think about the difference between this anger care and anger hate is it can help me to think of it in terms of object walls and horizons, where anger care is horizontal, but it can shift into objects and walls. It can shift into logos and eros. And that's when you can get some trouble. But then, of course, going back to Plato, if you maintain the horizon, then the eros is better and the logos is better. And that's true, right? Like when you have a philosophical conversation, you don't know what you're going to talk about. The logos seems to be more alive. When you have a horizon, there's more desire and more interest. Like when people first start dating and it's unknown, the erotic tension can be much higher. When you're married for a long time, it can be threatened because the horizon goes away, right? This is what Plato wanted to really emphasize, is that horizon supercharges the other two, right? If you lose the horizon, the other two become kind of hard. Well, that's the meaning crisis. The meaning crisis, if we use that language, is when logos and eros become like hard and they lose their dynamic, right? But here's the issue. If you have a horizon and you don't have any walls or objects, what does that mean? There was a nuclear apocalypse. Everything was destroyed. You destroyed everything. Or humans were never born because there's just a nature, right? So if there's just a horizon, everything got destroyed or humans were never born, right? So this is the weird thing. That means if humans are going to exist, there has to be the risk of this mistake. If this mistake is not there, that means the human is gone. Rather, we've been replaced by the machine or we blew ourselves up, right? So this difference, I think, is really important. I think it is time to care. I think by keeping in mind the anger care versus the anger hate distinction, as I'm calling it here, is very important. Now, also on this idea of change, I don't think humans can change except by a horizon, interesting enough. Like an object it can't change us. We just get it. A wall just blocks us. A horizon. The only way humans change is horizon, right? And if humans don't change, they tend to like die. There's no becoming, right? So there's no life. So you're talking about this dying. Like the horizon is what affords the dying every moment because there's something you care about that you're changing into. So you're changing, you're sacrificing, like becoming in the Hegelian sense, and death are tied to horizon. Like how can you become if you don't have a horizon? Like if you have a horizon, you have being or nothing, but you don't have becoming, right? Which, for Hegel, of being, those are abstractions, right? So you either have a being that's a pure being that's not you because you're not pure being, or you have a nothingness that's nihilism. So you have a being that you're not participating in, or you have a nothingness you don't care about. You have to have a horizon for being in nothingness to become becoming, right? Which is more temporal, right? You can't have a temporal being as becoming without a horizon, right? And the horizon is thematic. I think the issue now is, like you're saying, and this is what Fukuyama understood, and following Owen's tremendous book, is that Defensology, I love this man, is basically what Plato and Socrates saw the role of the philosopher is basically maintaining the harmony of the soul in all circumstances. And today, basically that means if the main problem today is a thymotic deficit, and I do think it is, I think the main problem today is a thymotic deficit without a question. Well, then the role of the philosopher today is to figure out how to regain the thematic. Like maybe 100 years from now, the role will be to bring back the logos. Maybe 200 years now will be to bring back the eros, right? Like there were Puritan times where eros was lost and the role of the philosopher was to bring it back. There was Enlightenment times where logos was lost, so the philosopher needed to bring it back. And there are times where the thymotic is lost and the philosopher needs to bring it back, right? Because you can't have the harmony of the soul unless you have all three, right? So the philosopher has a dynamic role that historically shifts based on what parts of the soul is not there at the time, right? And basically right now, the role of the philosopher is psychoanalytical. It is therapeutic because it's thematic, and all of these things are primarily thematic ultimately. And so that's why I think we see an age where the philosophers seem to be more in the realm of thinking things like psychoanalysis, thinking things like emotions and anger and mental health, and then popularism and uprising and ideology and liaisons and death drive. Why? Those are all things of Thymos. Those are not things that are exclusively logos or even primarily logos or eros. They are ultimately the logos and eros forms of those deficits are at their fundamental level a thematic deficit, right? And so philosophy is now in that business. But what does that look like? Well, and like I think it's often with men, and Socrates never had to think the problem of a society where basically even the idea of war is distant from us, right? Like even if in peace times in the past, there was still the possibility the man could go to war like next year, right? Or that battle or conflict or barbaricism or nature, dang it. Like even if you had a good harvest, next harvest you may not, right? So there's always, even in peacetime, a feeling of thymotic potential. Thus, you could more stabilize your thymotic needs simply by knowing you needed to always be ready for the drought, ready for the rainstorm, ready for the barbarian, ready for the thing that occurs in the manual labor, right? Okay, the wind blows. So there was always a kind of, it's kind of funny. There was a standing reserve of Thymos that was actually kind of good. You know, Heidegger talks about standing reserve as bad. We're humans, and Marx talks to humans themselves have become standing reserve. But in the past, even when Thymos was not used, it was experienced as a standing reserve. And actually, funny enough, I kind of think Thymos is best as a standing reserve. Whereas if we don't have thymotic standing reserve, human beings in their labor power become standing reserve. We
Mm.
as humans become standing reserve, right? Just as Heidegger and Marx and all these people talk about. Because it is Thymos that is supposed to be standing reserve. That thing you always have on standing, on guard, that's reserve, the reserve military that's ready to go, that's always prepared. But you see, here's the problem. You eventually as a male get habituated to not having your Thymos in standing reserve because the weather is taken care of by the technology, because there are no world wars, because even if there are, we just use drones. Manual labor is mostly at a computer. You don't need Thymos to be on standing reserve. And so it feels like. And so it naturally, here's the point, it naturally isn't, unless you just make a point to do jujitsu or to go out of your way to get it, right? But it isn't your natural lived experience that naturally habituates you. Habitus, the sociologists talk about that. It doesn't naturally orient you to a standing reserve of Thymos, right? So then there's a deficit. Then men are like, what do we do with this? Because it doesn't go away. I feel the lack of that standing reserve. I feel something lost in it. And when you lack Thymos, you lack motivation. And if you lack motivation, what's that? Boredom. Because boredom is not a state of having nothing to do. It's a state where you see no significance in what you could do. So why? What's the point, right? And notice how in boredom, logos is the prime active unit. Why? Who cares? What's the point? That's all the philosopher's question. Boredom is funny because it's very philosophical. Why? What's the point? Who cares? What will it do? You're just asking a bunch of questions. You're using questions to stop you from acting, right? So it's in boredom, you see logos has been let down by eros. The pleasure's not there. Or in boredom, you do go to pornography and eros, right? Because that gets you out of the book. So eros comes in, but eventually there can come a point where that no longer titillizes, and that, you can read a book like Porn, on your This Is Your Brain on Porn or whatever, and you see what happens to people in that. So even if the eros fails, though, logos comes in, and it will be there. So you're left with a logos that says why? Why? And funny enough, notice how logos, like boredom is the revelation that logos cannot be the final mover. Because you never do find a why. You're stuck there. Thymos can get you going. Because F you, Horizon. I don't need a reason. The Horizon said I couldn't do it. I'm going, dang it. Logos is like, why? And you're like, shut up, Logo. And you're going to the mountain. But when you're bored, there's no Horizon that says, try me. And so you look for a why, and you never get a why. Why can never move you. Why can only give you reasons not to move or defend you while you're moving. Logos can defend you while you're moving, but it can never get you moving, right? And so in boredom, you're stuck using why to motivate you, and it can't. So that's that. So a society of boredom is one that's trying to move itself by logos, or that can only move itself by eros, and that works until the eros ceases to work. And then people can get more extreme in their eros, more kinky, more outlandish, or give up and just fall into logos, right? So those things go together. All of those follow from thymotic deficits, right? So the
Yep.
philosopher needs to be in the business of thymotic regaining, which would be a psychoanalysis of anger, would be more
Mm.
in that realm and thinking about things of anger care. Let me throw it back to you.
Yeah, I love that. As you were talking about, returning the thymotic as the role of the philosopher,
Yeah,
I thought about, you know, how to do that. And first thing that came to me is play.
yeah,
And, there's a lot of work that's, becoming a lot more popular around, things like evolved move play with with Rafe Kelly and
Yeah.
Kyle Koch, and they've spoken to Vervaeke, and Vervaeke's gone out and
Yeah.
done these retreats, and Guy Sengstock and things like that. And there's like a primal sensibility that's being cultivated there, where there's a spontaneity, a reliance on intuition, a reliance on drive and desire, like a real like engagement of. I mean, I haven't participated in one of these myself, but I have really close friends who are like not only have done them, but like have also led some of these retreats. And
Wow.
like there's this sense of like this kind of like libido that is just like
Hmm.
just on supercharge. And I think there's a lot of, it seems like what's happening now as it's kind of evolving and kind of becoming more mainstream is like I think they're trying to think more critically about how to nest that within like the wisdom traditions,
Yeah.
and like have it oriented towards virtue. um because there's a potential, if it's not, for it to kind of just devolve into like, okay, like let's get our animalistic
Yeah.
instincts
Yeah.
out,
Yeah.
and then what? And then we go back to normal society, to our desk jobs, and forget about it.
Yeah.
Like, and so I think that they're taking that really seriously. It sounds like, um, and so another point that I wanted to touch on is this idea that the most, for me, I've noticed it really gets activated in periods of depravity.
Yeah.
So like my entry into philosophy, when I was 18, I started uh first started listening to a podcast about Buddhism, and then got really enthralled by, these ideas of interdependence and impermanence, and these Zen koans that just like were just, I mean, mind blowing to me. And started, you know, yeah, getting more into kind of Buddhism was the start. But it was fueled by, now that I think of it, like it was fueled by my own anger at my own personal situation of like my parents, and it kind of the impetus for like getting into philosophy was like I could not understand how my parents had such wildly different
Yeah.
understandings and perspectives on the same events of my childhood. Like, and I was
Yeah.
like, what is truth? I had like a serious meaning crisis of like, what do I believe? Who do I believe? Like, what is truth? And I was angry. I was like, no one's telling me,
Yeah.
no one's telling it to me straight. Um, and and that was my entry into philosophy. And so I think if like anger, and I was talking about it with Aspasia, it's like anger holds so much wisdom if
Yeah.
we really attend to like what is what is motivating what is motivating it at
Yeah.
its core. Why is it there? What is it responding to? And what does it have to say? um and I think what I was able to, I don't know, somehow channel it to, although not perfectly, was into a journey of discovery as opposed to a kind of final like um conclusion of, like, what I didn't do was like get really angry and then just make my own truth that was just solid and rigid and like, just F you to everyone,
Yeah.
and like I'm gonna live my way. Like it I somehow was able to approach it from the sense of like I want to I really want to understand. Like I really want to go on a journey, and eventually I want to find this out for myself.
Yeah.
But like I positioned it in a way where like that will always be something that I will continue to do. And so philosophy is like now a lifelong journey for me. And I think when people can identify where their anger is coming from and orient it towards a horizon as opposed to an object or a wall, Um, I remember hearing the story. I got really into Andrew Yang's uh,
Sure. Yeah.
2020 campaign for presidency,
Oh
and
yeah.
he talked a lot about men's issues. And I remember he had this man who he cited frequently on the campaign trail who said, he joined a neo-Nazi group when he was 15, and a recruiter like reached out to him online or something, and he was like, if anyone reached out to me, a mentor, a teacher, a coach, I would have listened to them.
Yeah.
Like, it really almost didn't have anything to do with what the movement stood for. It was that someone wanted him
Yeah.
and he was valued and he was fighting for a cause. Um, and so many people don't have that. And so, but they feel all this anger as a result of it. And so to tune into that and to listen to it, and I think ideally have support around you, ideally have mentors and people who um, can guide you into a lifelong love of wisdom as opposed to a lifelong hate of the other or something.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think unfortunately I'm coming up to my time, and I know we didn't talk about story at all, but I feel like we weaved a story of our own, and I
Yeah.
think we have a 4 hour conversation upcoming.
I
So,
believe so. Well, actually,
I always say leave a little meat on the bone in
I
anything I
agree.
do, any place I go. You have a reason to come back.
I agree. I actually think it's perfect because I think basically the play that adds wisdom to it moves into creativity. And
Yeah.
actually story and art would be
Perfect.
perfect.
And I actually should probably run as well. But the last thing I'll say, I've really enjoyed this. You're fantastic. Thank you. Um, I increasingly wonder if people are driven into philosophy by whatever the sole deficit is of their age. So maybe in the
Mm,
past, there was a deficit of logos. So it was the lack of logos when there was a lot of thymos and eros that made people go to philosophy. In another age, when eros was suppressed as dirty and sex was bad, then it was sex that moved people to philosophy. Ours is one where it is, my experience is a lot of people in philosophy now are coming into it from some sort of thematic issue. Like it's a thematic deficit where something is off. Like why, like their anger, like why did this happen? Why this doesn't make any sense, right? I feel like in history, and that I think also is a hint on why philosophy seems to have such different character at different historical times, right? Like during the Enlightenment, philosophy is very logos, it's very more kind of logosy, right? Well, once you get to existentialism and Bataille and all these people, it has a more erotic sense. It's more of a sexual liberation. The 60s, there's more of that kind of thing. And today it's more thymos, right? And I'd be interested, to go through history and look at that, right? And I wonder if you get uniquely good philosophy in periods where all three are harmonized, or maybe you get no philosophy at all, because what's the point, right? So
yeah, you
I
don't need
do
it. Yeah.
think a lot of people today, there's a kind of thymotic deficit. Anger, a lot of the people doing philosophy, it's anger and things like that that are moving them into it. And yeah, I mean, I would say play, serious play, creativity. I what I would say is this. Um, in the same way, and then I'll stop. Is that Thymos Horizon, Logos Walls, Eros Objects. I'm thinking more and more about Eros Fantasy, Logos Hypothetical, and Thymos Imagination, actually. And I
Mm,
think that the realm of Thymos that actually is bound together with wisdom is a creative act. And that makes me think of Berjayev. And I think it's like, because if you really do creativity, like you're trying to create a business, it will kill you if you're really serious about it, right? But in a good way, because it's a horizon of, the horizon of starting the business says what? Try me. All right. Well, the same as if you're really serious about fiction. So we can talk about it next time. Like if you really want to write a story that isn't a melodrama, that's really touching something beautiful, that's going to make people emotionally moved, then the story will kill you because you have to re-edit and rewrite and rethink it. You're like, why isn't it's working? It's a good So the story is a horizon that says, try me, right? there's something very thematic about imagination. Eros is fantasy. You fantasize, right? But imagination is not fantasy. Imagination is you have a vision of a girl or a story or something, and you're trying to bring it into language, but those words on that paper are just black ink and white marks, and they're not that, and you somehow have to point to that from that, and how the frick do you do that? So the Horizon says, try me. This is not a fantasy. This is a freaking challenge. And Logos is a hypothetical, trolley problems, coming up with these ideas, these interesting thought experiments, right? If you're doing fiction and it's imagination, it is not a thought experiment. It is a freaking obstacle. And so for next time, I think basically all of this on wise Thymos, wise play, wisdom, tradition, and play and Thymos that come together, it is going to today, I think, look like creativity. It's going to have a lot to do with creativity and imagination. Imagination is not fantasy. It is actually thematic. We've associated imagination with play and easy, and we don't think of imagination as a hard thing, as a difficult thing, as a serious play thing. We think of it as a pastime, but imagination will demand you to change your life, and that's a Horizon. Well, I don't know what the time went, Michael, so I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Here's the treat.
It went into the Horizon.
It went into the Horizon. Talk again, and we'll talk about stories, because I enjoyed Lupin. I'm very curious. Lupin Wolf, girl, she's a beautiful character. I love going down to the pond. The imagery you described so well. I really enjoyed it. And we'll have to talk about it. So
so many of your stories. Your book behind me. I've read. I think the most recent one I read was Esperanza. It was so unbelievable. And yeah, there's so much I'd love to talk to you about. One thing before you go, if Michelle can make it, I would love to talk with her as well, because I know obviously both of you wrote the book. So yeah, I'd love to hear also just how a dual creative process works, and yeah, I would love to hear about that. So
well, I am beyond. I don't know if anyone's read Esperanza in like 7 years, so I really am honored that you read it. Well, thank you for reading Esperanza. Artemio and Esperanza I think about a lot. So well, thank you, Mike. We'll have to do that. So thank you, sir.
It makes me want to go to Cuba now.
Yeah, I tell you, to Havana.
I was really getting into it. I was like, clearly they've either been there or they have some contact on the ground who knows every corner bodega in Havana. But yeah, no, it was just brilliant detail and storytelling, and in just such a short period of time in your stories, like are able to just create such rich characters, and it's really a feat to be able to do that. So yeah.
Well, that means the world, Michael. Well, thank you. Well, we'll have to arrange that. Well, best to you, sir. I've really enjoyed it. And
you as well.
And have a good evening. All the best.